All right, hey comrades, welcome to the second meeting of Liberation School's class on Volume 1 of Marxist Capital. I'm Marisa Sanchez, a PSL member in New York City and member of the Liberation School Editorial Collective. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 1 of the book, the chapter on commodities. So hopefully it didn't give you too much trouble and the reading guides helped. So I'll turn it over now to Derek Ford, a PSL member in Indianapolis and editor of Liberation School. And then afterwards, I'll facilitate the question and answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Marisa, and thank you, comrades, for coming to class 2, where we're talking about the commodity, which is where Marx begins. There's a question as to, whether if he has to begin here. Some people actually recommend starting to read Capital a little bit later on when he's talking about surplus value and exploitation, just because it's sort of more accessible in the sense that it's something that workers experience day in and day out. But if you're thinking about the real concrete, one of the ways in which it presents itself is as an accumulation of commodities, which is the first line, right? It presents itself in the Penguin translation. I believe it appears as an immense accumulation of commodities. So that's where we begin. And a commodity, he says, is in the first place an object outside of us. So it's alien to us. It's a thing that satisfies human wants of some sort or another. But the nature of such wants makes no difference to the inquiry that Marx is engaging in here, right? He isn't concerned with the actual qualities of particular use values and says that that's the work of history. It might be the work of sociology, in a contemporary time, because as we'll see, the use value is a qualitative and singular characteristic of a commodity. And so, the same commodity can have different use values for different people, right? Or in different times. So it's really the use value of commodities that he isn't really concerned with, but obviously, the use values of commodities are particularly important, and use value is really important in the rest of the book. So every useful thing may be looked at from 2 points of view, of quality and quantity. It's an assemblage of many other properties and therefore can be seen in other ways. There's a complexity to any commodity, and let alone the vast, immense accumulation of them in the world. But this is the work of history. Marx is going to focus on the quantitative aspects of the commodity. So you'll note Marx's use of abstraction here, where he begins with wealth overall, he breaks it down into the commodity, and then he abstracts away from its use value, right? So there's a couple of different kinds of abstraction happening. So the use value of a commodity is qualitative. It's about a utility. It has some kind of social usefulness. And that usefulness obviously changes throughout time. So what's of use today might not be of use tomorrow. And it's not about an individual use, it's about a collective use, because there has to be more than one individual, right, who can use something in order for it to be produced as a commodity. The use value of a commodity is realized through its consumption, so its use. And its use value is tied to the actual properties of the commodity, right? So like a t-shirt, the use that you get from it, if it's protecting you or warming you or whatever, right, that's a property of the actual content. Or if the use value is like the graphic on the t-shirt, that's a property of the graphic itself, right, the design, the colors, and all that. And then Marx says, in the form of society we are about to consider, they are in addition the material depositories of exchange value. And he doesn't really say anything else about this, but I think it's important to point out because he's basically leaving the door open for other interpretations or uses of the commodity outside of capitalism. Exchange value, on the other hand, is a quantitative relation. So it's basically the relation of one commodity to other commodities. And this relation is constantly changing with time and place. So because it's constantly changing, it appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, an exchange value that is inseparably connected with, inherent in commodities, seems a contradiction in terms. So if two different commodities are exchangeable, they have to have something in common that they're reducible to. And this can't be a physical property, because there aren't, if it had to be, if the exchangeable property of it had to be something related to the material composition of the commodity, or the good, right, or the service, then you wouldn't be able to exchange any commodity for any other commodity, right? So we have to, again, abstract away from use value. And what is the thing that all commodities have in common? It's that they're the result of labor, right? And then, so I think here's the interesting thing, is that Marx begins by saying that the wealth of society under capitalism presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, which we might think of as like objects or services. But then very quickly, right, like the next page, basically, we see that actually it's labor, right, and labor power in particular. But it's not just any kind of labor. There's two kinds of labor that correspond with the use value and the exchange value of the commodity. There's concrete labor, which is qualitative, and that's what produces the use value, or corresponds to the use value, I should say. And then there's abstract labor, which is quantitative and corresponds to exchange value. So the concrete labor is the actual material labor process that goes into producing a particular commodity, right? And that means working with particular raw materials in a particular labor process, maybe a particular sort of arrangement of the labor process. And that will be different for different commodities. And then abstract labor is the sort of general capacity of labor, right? So it's concrete labor we might think of as like the actual physical act of labor. And then abstract labor is kind of a conception, but it's not just an idea, because it's something that actually is integral to the functioning of capitalism, right? If there were no such thing as abstract labor, if we couldn't equate different concrete labors, then we wouldn't be able to exchange commodities, right? So how do we measure the value of a commodity? And Marx says here, the total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, composed though it be of innumerable individual units. Each of these units is the same as any other, so far as it has the character of the average labor power of society. That is, so far as it requires for producing a commodity no more time that is needed on an average, no more than is socially necessary. So the value of a commodity, or value in general, is socially necessary labor time. And what this means basically is that it's the average time that it takes with the average sort of level of intellect, technological development, arrangement of production that it takes to produce a commodity. So this is why if it takes me, 10 hours to make one t-shirt, and it takes somebody else 2 hours to make the same t-shirt, my t-shirt isn't more valuable than theirs just because I had to expend more labor time in it, because I'm actually, in the example, I'm producing way beyond the socially necessary labor time, in essence. Now, there's the socially necessary labor time is determined by skill, by science, the application of science, by education, the social organization of production, the organization within the workplace, the means of production, the physical conditions, and et cetera. And this will be important later on in the book when we begin to discuss the law of value and the sort of internal dynamics of capitalism and its constant revolutionizing of the means of production. And of course, there are also spatial differences in this because, I mean, on the one hand, you could think of the totality of the world as having an average, socially necessary labor time, but there are all sorts of things that sort of complicate that. For example, distribution, right? Or, transporting goods from one place to another. And this is really one thing that tariffs do is they can kind of artificially, or they can define socially necessary labor time and therefore value within the confines of the nation state. Because if the US, for example, imposes tariffs on China, which means that those importing those goods have to pay more for them, then it'll work to raise the exchange value of the commodity from China so that it's more in line or it's higher than that in the United States. Okay, so something can be a use value without having a value, right? He gives the example of air, soil, meadows. So you can have, you can find something useful that basically isn't the product of human labor. This is called the free gifts of nature. And although a lot of nature, of course, has previous labor power embedded in it, it's not really like an autonomous thing that exists apart from society. And this is something that, Marx and Engels addressed in the German ideology. They wrote that even at that point in time, there wasn't like any part of nature that had been untouched by humanity. And something can be a use value and the product of human labor without being a commodity. And this is, for example, like if you produce something for a friend, because you're not producing it to exchange on a market. And so it's sort of outside of this consideration. It doesn't have an exchange value. It's not being produced in order to be sold. So therefore, a commodity has to be produced for exchange value, right? And there has to be a social use value for it. And this is generally referred to as Marx's labor theory of value, but it's a term that, at least as far as I'm aware, Marx never used. He did talk about value theory. So obviously value is socially necessary labor time. David Ricardo also had a labor theory of value, which held that the value of a commodity is the amount of labor that went into its production. And Ricardo was responding to theories of value that held that it was totally subjective. So he was trying to find something objective in it. But Ricardo also didn't really understand the difference between price and value, which we'll get to, I think, next class. And it was really a labor theory of value based on concrete labor. And there's debates about the relationship between Marx and Ricardo relative to value theory, and specifically whether or not Marx accepted and then expanded upon Ricardo's definition, or whether or not he sort of rejected it altogether. And this really falls on the fact that value isn't just produced, it's also realized. So it's not just labor time. And as we'll see from Marx, socially necessary labor time, it's because it includes, right, science, the application of science, education, and the social organization of society, as well as the workplace. It's obviously not something that's determined in any one factory, and actually it's determined throughout all of society, right, wherever those things are being produced, right, and are changing the time necessary, the skill necessary, and so on and so forth. But as long as you know that value is socially necessary labor time, you're good to move on. And we'll continue to flesh out exactly what value is for Marx as we move on. There is a note that exchange value is different from value, but exchange value is the only way that value can be expressed. So Marx will often use the terms interchangeably, right? But also, right, value is sort of a unity of use value and exchange value. or it is a unity of use value and exchange value. And it's a unity of opposites, because use value is qualitative and singular. It's intrinsic to the commodity itself. Exchange value is quantitative. It's not intrinsic. You can't realize both at the same time. You can't use a commodity and sell it at the same time. So it's a unity of opposites, and that's what value is. So therefore, for value, there's not only a quantitative dimension, there's also a qualitative dimension. And that's why Marx is going to, oftentimes just talk about value and exchange value together, sort of synonymously. And so, okay, section 2 is a twofold character of labor. This is the definition of value we've been talking about. And we can move on. I'll just give you a second in case you want to read through this. Okay, and then we go back to labor. So different use values have different labor powers. This develops into a social division of labor, but he says that commodity production isn't necessary for the division of labor. So in other words, the division of labor is not something that came about with capitalism. For simplicity, Marx assumes that labor is unskilled and simple, and that complex labor is just an intensification or a multiplication of simple labor, right? So like 1 hour of simple labor equals 2 hours of complex labor, for example. He doesn't really justify this. He says experience shows that this reduction takes place all the time. I think that one way the reduction takes place is actually through exchange, because when you exchange a commodity that's a result of complex labor with one that's a result of simple labor, you're in a sense equating them, and it follows that you could reduce the labor power in the complex product with the one of the simple product. So far, therefore, as labor is a creator of use value, it's useful labor. It is a necessary condition independent of all forms of society for the existence of the human race. It is an eternal nature-imposed necessity without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature, and therefore no life. So labor itself is not a property of capitalism, right? And so there's a different abstraction taking place when we speak about labor as a whole as the transformation of nature by humans into something useful for them so that they can survive or do other things, right? Expand their needs and wants. But labor will take particular forms under different modes of production. And so Marx isn't really talking about labor, but labor power, which is labor that's commodified, that's bought and sold, that has a use value and exchange value. Okay, and then we get to the abstraction of labor away from concrete labor. Tailoring and weaving are obviously qualitatively different. They're each a productive expenditure of human brains, nerves, and muscles, and in this sense of human labor, they are but two different modes of expending human labor power, but the value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract. So again, abstracting away from the concrete manifestations of it, the particular use values of the labor power going into it. So value is a social relation. It's therefore dynamic. If socially necessary labor time changes, value also changes, right? So if technology is introduced that reduces production time, it will also reduce value. Or if workers in an entire industry go on strike for a month, or 25% of workers in the industry strike for a month, right? That will, that can have the effect of increasing value that's existing, because it would be increasing the socially necessary labor time for the production. Or if the government orders factories to close because of a pandemic, it can also increase the value because it will increase the socially necessary labor time, right? So there's kind of a contradiction in that as productivity increases, value can decrease. Right? And so if we think about wealth as the accumulation of use values, you can have a situation in which there's more use values, so therefore there's more wealth, but there's actually less value and therefore less exchange value. And this will become clear later on in the book, like a lot of this stuff, really. And this is where he goes through to show that this is a social relation and it's dynamic. He talks about what can happen to value under a couple of different circumstances. And I think it's important to note that this holds for all commodities existing at a certain time. So if I produce, 100 t-shirts in an hour today, and that's a socially necessary labor time, then right, each t-shirt, then the 100 t-shirts as a whole will have, what did I say? How long was I? Okay, 100 t-shirts in an hour, right? So the 100 t-shirts will have 1 hour of labor time, and that's socially necessary. But if tomorrow somebody figures out a way to make 200 t-shirts in 1 hour, my shirts are already on the market. And so it's not as if their value is tied to the labor time that actually went into it, right? The introduction of new technology that speeds it up will decrease the value of my commodities that are on the market. And this will present obviously a problem for capitalists, because you can't guarantee that an innovation won't come along, right? And so therefore there's kind of a thrust or a drive to shorten the time between production and consumption to as little as possible. And section 3 is the form of value or exchange value. So again, value isn't a material thing, but a social relation. So the value of commodities is the very opposite of the coarse materiality of their substance. Not an atom of matter enters into its composition. Turn and examine a single commodity by itself, as we will, yet insofar as it remains an object of value, it seems impossible to grasp. So you can't see value, right? You can see the use value of a commodity, right? You can see the material characteristics that determine its use, right? Or provide the setting for its use. But you can't see exchange value, you can't see the value. Everyone knows that commodities have a value form common to them all. I mean, their money form. Here, however, a task is set to us, the performance of which has never yet been attempted by bourgeois economy. The task of tracing the genesis of this money form, of developing the expression of value implied in the value relation of commodities from its simplest, almost imperceptible outline to the dazzling money form. So this is where this exposition is leading, right? Chapter 1 is on commodities, chapter 2 is on exchange, and chapter 3 is on money. Bourgeois economy just sort of takes money as it is, but Marx is interested in how did money actually develop, right? What were the driving forces that brought about the need for money? And then once money enters the circulation process and the production process, how does it change the contradictions within those processes, right? For example, the contradiction between use value and exchange value. So money is a form of value that's common to everything, right? Anything can be exchanged for money. All commodities can be exchanged for money. But the important thing is that, and we'll see this in the last section, is that money appears as a thing, commodities appear as things, but they're actually dynamic processes of labor power, right? And social relations. So this section is difficult and tedious. There's a lot of equations happening, but Marx is basically showing how money arises out of exchange. And this isn't like, necessarily a historical argument per se. Like, it's not like Marx is, looking back to identify when money was introduced where, and so on and so forth. It's more of a sort of like theoretical argument that, it's intuitive in some senses. I think it, and actually in many senses, I think it really just makes sense that basically there's commodities, and the only way we can know the value of a commodity, because it's not inside of it, is by putting it into a relation with other commodities, right? So for example, bartering. Marx gives the example of linen and coats, and I think, yeah, 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat. So you can't express the value of linen in linen. That would be a tautology. You have to express its value relative to something else. And so here, that's the coat. And so Marx sets up the relative and the equivalent form of value. So I always get these mixed up. I think I got it right on here. So yeah, in this example, linen is the relative commodity, and it needs an equivalent commodity to express its value, right? So 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat. So linen is the relevant form, the coat is the equivalent form. The equivalent form's role is to express the value of the relevant form, right? And the relative, the values again can change, right? And it becomes even more complicated here because we're not just talking about changes within the production of one commodity, but the production of different commodities. And so if, the socially necessary labor time for one of them increases or decreases, it will affect the value, the equivalent value of the relative commodity, right? This is it. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although its value remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies. And finally, simultaneous variations in the magnitude of value and in that of its relative expression by no means necessarily correspond in amount. So again, just keep in mind that value is a dynamic thing. It's not fixed. It's dependent upon socially necessary labor time, and there's a lot that goes into socially necessary labor time. It's not just a mere matter of having workers work faster, although that is one way in which to do it. The equivalent commodity expresses the value of the relative commodity. This is a contradiction of sorts because it means that one thing is the expression of something totally different from it. So there has to be the social relation at the bottom of it, which is labor power. He discusses 3 particularities of the equivalent commodity. So one is that a commodity is congealed labor, and the equivalent commodity must appear as abstract labor. But it has to be of a different use value. So concrete labor is manifested in a sense as abstract labor in the other commodity. And then I think most importantly is private labor takes the form of its opposite, labor directly in its social form. So if I produce my t-shirts by myself, that we could see that as a private labor. But then when there's in order for there to be exchange value, it has to be in a relationship to an equivalent commodity. And so therefore my own private labor is in a direct relationship with somebody else's labor, right? And this is really the first, I think, attack on liberal individualism that we see in this chapter and in this book. Okay, so then the question is, how is it that this can really happen, and why hasn't it been realized before? And he goes to Aristotle and he says, well, Aristotle couldn't figure out how 2 unequal things could be equal because of the material conditions of his time, right? The peculiar conditions of the society in which he lived alone prevented him from discovering what in truth was at the bottom of this equality. Because it was a slave society. And so there wasn't generalized wage labor. And so therefore there wasn't socially necessary labor time that was at the bottom of the sort of root that enabled commodities to be exchanged, right? And for the relative form to be related to the equivalent form. And then so we have a system first in which one commodity is being related to another commodity, but then we can imagine that we're not just exchanging linen for coats, we also are exchanging for food and for services, animals, and so on and so forth. So there's an expanded form of value, which is when, let's say, the linen, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or it can also equal, 5 hats or 30 socks, and so on and so on and so on. It's really infinite. And you could do this. I mean, if you wanted to, right? You could figure out, you could take any commodity, your computer, for example, and think about how much you could exchange it for any other commodity in the market, right? And then there's the general form, which is 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat, which is equal to 5 hats, and so on and so forth. So in the first example, it's expanded because the range of options are expanded, but in the general form, it's not just a range of options, it's like a sort of chain that's constructed. And then money, of course, becomes the general form. The general form expresses the values of the whole world of commodities in terms of a single commodity set apart for the purpose, namely the linen, and thus represents to us their values by means of their equality with linen. And then a single commodity comes to serve as the general social relative form of value, money. And if you think about it, it makes sense why this would come to be, because it's much easier to just put everything, all the commodities, right, X, Y, and Z in relationship to commodity A than it is to think about the sort of like infinite possibilities of each particular commodity. Right? So that this is what money does, and we'll talk more about this in the next class. But for now, this is the story of really where money arises from. It arises to mediate exchange, the exchange of goods, to make it simpler. Because there's also the question of transport, for example, where if you had to directly barter every single thing, it would be, you have to transport everything back and forth. But with money, that's not the case. You can just take the money to wherever you need to go and purchase your commodity. And then the final section is the fetishism of commodities and the secret thereof. This section was initially left out of the first German edition. Marx put it in later in the second edition, and it stayed until then. And what's a fetish? It's a belief that an object has power, basically, right? So like in spiritual or religious uses, an object might be endowed with magical qualities. For example, if you hang, a symbol of your religion or whatever on your, rear view mirror, then think that object will be working, there'll be a magical property attached to that object that will prevent you from getting pulled over or whatever. That's a fetishism, right? And so Marx wants to understand the fetishism of commodities and what's really happening, right? What the commodity really is. So it appears at first sight as a very trivial thing and easily understood. But its analysis shows us, in reality, it's a very queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. A commodity is a mysterious thing simply because in it, the social character of labor appears to us as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor. Because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their labor power is presented to them as a social relation existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. There is a definite social relation that assumes in our eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things. So what does this all mean? I mean, I think it's kind of easy to understand, because when you go into any store, we sort of spontaneously think that we're interacting as private consumers with a series of goods, right? And I'm using my labor, which is my money, to exchange for other goods. And so but what is it that makes that exchange possible? It's that they're all the products of labor power. And I don't see that, and I don't think about that. And there's nothing in the store that would really tell me about the labor that went into the production of all the products in the store, right? I just see a price tag. I don't think about, the process of production or the conditions of production or the labor struggles that went on in the development of the product, harvesting or its picking, its production, the transportation, or the sort of trade and tariff regulations that sort of facilitated or hampered its transportation. And we don't think about like who designed it, who packaged it, all of that, right? We just think about it as, I have my money. It's a sort of object, right? And I'm exchanging it for another object. And this is one source of confusion amongst bourgeois political economy. Marx says this at the end of the chapter, that bourgeois political economy sees use value as independent of its material because it's realized outside of exchange, because you produce it outside, or you consume it outside of exchange. But then it will see value as like an intrinsic character of the commodity, because that's something that's actually realized through exchange. But this is, private laborers, we really come into contact with each other most through exchange, but we don't think about it like that. We think that we're just coming into exchange with other objects. And this is why the character of labor is necessarily hidden. And this is also the material basis of bourgeois ideology, right? So let's read this. Hence, when we bring the products of labor into relation with each other as values, it is not because we see in these articles the material receptacles of homogeneous human labor. Quite the contrary, whenever by an exchange we equate as values our different products, by that very act we also equate as human labor the different kinds of labor expended upon them. We are not aware of this, nevertheless we do it. And that's a footnote, 28. Value, therefore, does not stalk about with a label describing what it is, even though it has a price tag, right? That's the exchange value. It's not properly the value. And the exchange value also isn't, so the exchange value isn't value, right? It is value, rather, that converts every product into a social hieroglyphic. Later on, we try to decipher the hieroglyphic to get behind the secret of our own social products. For to stamp an object of utility as a value, it is just as much a social product as language. The recent scientific discovery that the products of labor, so far as they are values, are but material expressions of the human labor spent in their production, marks indeed an epoch in the history of the development of the human race, but by no means dissipates the mist through which the social character of labor appears to us to be an objective character of the products themselves. And I'm unclear whether or not Marx is shouting himself out here or is shouting out David Ricardo. There's not a footnote attached to this particular point, but in any case, this is the material basis of ideology, right? So ideology, there's many definitions of it, but one way to think about ideology is it's a general way in which we make sense of the world and our place in it, right? And so capitalist ideology presents us and the world and our relations in a particular way, but it doesn't just arise out of thin air. It's not as if there's capitalism and then the capitalists are like, wait, this is terrible. We have to figure out like how we're gonna, make this acceptable to people. And then, that happens. That does happen, right? That's why we have education and the media and all of that, but it doesn't come from sort of the idea, right? It doesn't come from the ideal. It comes from the material reality of capitalist exchange, right? So capitalism develops increasingly sophisticated sort of ways of producing and disseminating ideology, but it does so from the very material operations of capitalism. They're not something that are imposed from outside. And then Marx talks about the Robinson Crusoe and the myth of individualism. Basically, Robinson Crusoe, the liberals love him because he found himself on an island, and was totally independent, and just sort of then began to basically be like a little capitalist bookkeeper. But Marx is like, well, one, he had Commodities with him, but he also had the framework of capitalism with him. So that's why he was making sense of this, right? So that's not like a justification for capitalism. And this is, really one of Marx's primary critiques of bourgeois political economy, at that time, and it's also one that's incredibly relevant for us today. I mean, in essence, right, capitalism wants to present capitalism as a natural state of human being, and so therefore something that we shouldn't change. And if there's a problem in society, it's because we're not obeying the laws of nature, right, which is capitalism. But instead, obviously, capitalism is a historical system, and therefore it's a contingent system and something that could be negated into something else. So in order to do this, the bourgeois political economists, they read capitalism back into history. And this is, I think, this is familiar to us today because of neoliberalism, in which, we're all supposed to be like individual, atomized people looking out for our own self-interests. And that's just the way that it is. But this is, there's a whole there's basically like infinite actual anthropological research, not to mention other forms of knowledge, right? Narratives and stories and so on, that in which the sort of knowledge of history is transmitted, that disprove this. But the point is that bourgeois political economy doesn't engage in any abstraction in order to separate out historical periods, right? It's in the same way that you could say, okay, well, labor takes place today and labor took place, 2,000 years ago. And so therefore labor under capitalism is fine, right? Because you haven't engaged in that abstraction. You haven't abstracted labor power away from labor. And the individual itself is really a recent invention, right? It's really an 18th century invention that the bourgeois political economists then read back into the past. And if you're interested in this and also more of Marx's method, you should read the introduction to the Grundrisse notebooks. The very first part is a critique of this individualism, and he says that they project the individual into the past as a natural starting point of history and not as sort of a historical end point, and therefore the historical beginning point of another kind of history. And this was also one of Marx's critiques of Proudhon, is that Proudhon totally took the individual for granted, right, as a starting and the ending point of society. And the task was then to just rearrange society around the individuals in a different way. But Marx insists that the individual itself is a product of, capitalism, but also political institutions and political relations. There's obviously a contradiction here, just kind of as an aside, with liberalism and especially neoliberalism, because on the one hand, we're told that like capitalism is the way that it's what's in nature, but then on the other hand, all these like the latest technology gadgets or apps or whatever are sold to us as a way to like disrupt the past and nature and to free us from the sort of nightmare of the past, right? So this is an interesting contradiction. But one of the important things is that capitalism masks interdependence and dependence as independence. And this is, again, important because it shows how capital arises, or how the ideology of capital arises out of the actual production and circulation of capital, right? Not just through the media. Because, and money has a lot to do with it too, which we'll talk about more next week. Okay, so this is the fetishism of the commodity. And then Marx turns to another vision. Okay, let us now picture to ourselves, by way of change, a community of free individuals carrying on their work with the means of production in common, in which the labor power of all the different individuals is consciously applied as the combined labor power of the community. All the characteristics of Robinson's labor are here repeated, but with this difference, that they are social instead of individual. Everything produced by him was exclusively the result of his own personal labor, and therefore simply an object of use for himself, right? He wasn't exchanging it. He wasn't producing it in order to exchange it. The total product of our community of free individuals with the means of production in common, it's a social product. One portion serves as fresh means of production and remains social, but another portion is consumed by the members as means of subsistence. A distribution of this portion amongst them is consequently necessary. The mode of this distribution will vary with the productive organization of the community and the degree of historical development attained by the producers. So this is a vision of communism. It's one of them that shows up throughout the book. And I think when we're reading the book, we should take note of all the places that Marx makes reference to the communist future, because it's not obviously like a systematically, in-depth look. I mean, Marx didn't really believe that we could do that we could, paint a picture of what the future would look like. But they're nonetheless important. Sometimes he emphasizes different sort of characteristics of communism, the communist mode of production. So here we have free individuals who are working with the means of production in common, right? And it's consciously applied as a combined labor power of the community. So in other words, there's a plan, right? We might even say a central plan that's happening, because it's the product of all of society. So all of society has to operate according to a plan. We're also free individuals within this, right? But it's not the free individual of capitalism. It's a different kind of individual. And the reason why Marx is talking about individuals is because that's a common conception of people at that time. And so under communism, everything is produced for society as a whole, right? It's all of our products. And so one portion has to go as fresh means of production, right? And remain social. So in other words, some of what we produce has to go to ensuring that there will be more production in the future, but another part is consumed by the members of society to subsist, right? To live. And then we have to figure out how to distribute this portion. So we have to have a plan, right, to produce and then to distribute. It's not something that can happen spontaneously or through, I don't know, like affinity groups or something like that. It has to happen according to a settled plan, he says. Okay, we will assume, but merely for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by their labor time. Labor time would, in that case, play a double part. Its appointment in accordance with a definite social plan maintains the proper proportion between the different kinds of work to be done and the various wants of the community. On the other hand, it also serves as a measure of the portion of the common labor borne by each individual and of their share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producers with regard both to their labor and to its products are in this case perfectly simple and intelligible, and that with regard not only to production, but also to distribution. So in other words, under communism, the commodity doesn't have a fetish, because our labor power, which Marx is assuming that basically it's from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, right? It's from the labor time that I give that's what determines a portion of the products that I receive. So it's that also then will determine like how you're producing certain things, right? Which is another reason that you have to have a plan. And it also serves as it serves as a measure for what's produced and the production process, and it serves as a measure of what's distributed and the consumption process, right? But because it's all happening according to a settled plan in which we're actually thinking about what do we need to produce for society, right? To live and then to continue to live in the future. What are the needs of society, right? What kinds of labor power will we need to produce those commodities, right? Those goods, those services. And then what are our productive capacities, right? How many people would we need to allocate to what job, right? That there's a greater collective intelligence. There's not an anarchy of atomized individuals with no knowledge of other things that are, that's facilitated by the commodity fetishism or the money fetish, in which we think that money is, something like sort of a power unto itself, that money equals power, when in fact money equals sort of a claim on labor power, right, or accumulated labor power. That labor is actually central to the entire thing, and so therefore there's not the kind of alienation that arises from the fetishism of the commodity, right? And so let's end there, and we'll go to questions. And for next week, we'll be reading chapters 2 and 3. I would say pay attention to like the headings that Marx gives, because that's going to kind of tell you like what to be looking out for. I'll also, of course, send along the reading guide. I think chapter 2 is relatively easy. It's like a transition chapter, basically setting you up for the next chapter. Chapter 3, money, is a little bit more difficult. So again, I would say just push through it. It might be good to consult your reading guide from chapter 1 before you go on to chapter 2 and 3. And you can also, of course, email me if you have any questions. So thank you if you have to leave, and I'll see you comrades next week.